The next speaker is Douglas Kutach, and he's coming from West Indies, from Jamaica, and he's specialized in philosophy of science and especially causation.
Yes. So thanks. Ed and I are going to do a two-part talk. We've tried to communicate back and forth about the topics, and I think what we're going to end up with is just the right amount of overlap. So both of us are going to talk about a lot of contemporary theories, ones that are in the, say, the past 40 years, 45 years, and I'm going to say just a little bit about how I think, about whether I think they're compatible with causation. Ed will say more, but there's going to be quite a bit that I'm just choosing not to say because I know he'll take care of it. And I hope we'll just have just enough overlap to talk about the important differences. This is my shameless plug for a book on talking about a lot of theories of causation. In the book, I tried not to say too much about my own personal views, but just enough to guide you. But today I wanted to do a little bit of refinement and add a little bit of my own conceptual engineering to the topic, because I think it'll help us think about occasionalism in a new way. So you might say, naively speaking, my goal coming in here without me adding any of my own agendas, my goal is to survey contemporary theories over the past 45 years, so at least the most prominent ones, in order to identify whether they have efficient causation. And in that, in the process of thinking about how to answer the question, I want to make some changes in how we think about the problem to fit the better, what I think is a better conceptual organization. So I want to change the task instead to survey contemporary theories of causation in order to figure out which posit fundamental causation-like relations. So what I'm doing is I'm replacing the word real with fundamental and efficient causal relations with causation-like. And I'll just say a little bit more about them to give you a motivation of what's going on. So one is, I think, in order to conduct metaphysics properly, or not properly, but optimally, I think the whole world would do much better to abandon what I think here is a standard way of thinking about ontology, just to associate ontology with existence or being or reality. And I take it, just roughly speaking, a common picture many people have now is to think about the important distinction in metaphysics is between what is and what is not, what is real and what is not. And that's the picture I've tried to draw here. And then there's often a further distinction between fundamental reality and derivative reality. Sometimes this gets cashed out by grounding relations, sometimes with an appearance reality distinction, sometimes with supervenience, reduction, something like that. But the idea somehow in metaphysics is we find out what's real. And I think this has been a nearly unmitigated disaster in the intellectual history. And I think we would do much better to draw the line, to draw the important distinction between fundamental reality and the combination of derivative reality and non-existence. And here, I'm just not going to be able to explain all the justifications. A lot of the justification is just spelling out the consequences and all. But the intuitive picture is one that a lot of philosophers have, throughout history, have pointed out. Just to give you a quick example, the intuitive idea is that once you've settled on, say if you're an atomist, once you've settled on the idea that fundamental reality is atoms bouncing around in a void, there's not a whole lot extra philosophical work that you need to engage in order to distinguish trees from non-trees. The trees are just going to be assemblages of atoms. And so the idea here is that if we think about derivative, once we figure out what fundamental reality is and then how it relates in general to derivative reality, a lot of the problems we have with the existence of things ends up getting more easily solved. So what I'm going to be concerned about is, in the case of occasionalism, I think the core idea is that the fundamental causes are all gods, or that the kinds of causation we have in space and time, the kind of things we point to when we say, oh, here's a cause and here's an effect, that those are the kinds of things that are going to be non-fundamental. And so by making this distinction, if we can make all of the ordinary paradigmatic causes non-fundamental, then that's going to be compatible with occasionalism. That's going to be occasionalism friendly. The second qualification is that we need to be liberal about the word causation. A lot of times, people will build in an asymmetry to causation, for example, or they'll be concerned with what we think of as the important causes rather than kind of ignorable background causes. We just don't need to worry about that. And so I've put this picture up here to remind you of a classical kind of Newtonian deterministic universe where these slices here are supposed to be the entire state of the world at one time. And on these models, you specify everything that's everything fundamental on one of these slices. The laws will determine everything else that happens. A lot of people will say that's not causation. It goes forward and backward in time. Every slice determines itself, trivially. Those things we don't need to worry about. This is the kind of thing that, if there were these, you might say causal, there's some kind of robust, say fundamental relations of determination in such a model, that would be enough to me to say occasionalism is false, if the world were really like that, if fundamental reality were like that. So what I'm going to be concerned about is any kind of relations like this that are, causation-like relations that are underived. I'm sorry. Any kind of fundamental causation-like relation among stuff in space and time is going to be incompatible with occasionalism.
Can I interfere?
Oh, yeah.
Back to the place.
Oh, okay, yes.
Please. This affirms occasionalism because just a microphone.
In my opinion, this affirms occasionalism and do not negate.
Why?
Okay. Simply, just T1, T2, T3. Just imagine that these are photographs, 3 photographs for the surface of a pool, surface of a water pool, where you have dropped a stone. The first one, you will have a small circle. The second one, you will have 2 circles, one big and
okay.
The third, you have 3 circles. This is occasionalism.
There's nothing in the diagram that's incompatible with occasionalism. The thing that was incompatible with occasionalism was if you add to it this fundamental determination relation. If I say, there's not just all the different slices, but in addition, there's this, as it were, causal, there's a relation between the second slice and the third slice.
There can't be, because these are separate. T1, T2, T3, 3.
There can be, because people can just stipulate in their theory that these things exist. If someone stipulates in their model that there's a determination relation between these, I'll take them at their word, and then I'll say that's incompatible with occasionalism. That's all. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's a list of different theories we now have, and I've got a chart giving you the answers. I put a few of them in smaller typeface because we might not get to them. They're not as important. They're less, in the sense that they're less often advocated. What I have marked over on the right is either a peace sign to signify that they are, in my opinion, compatible with occasionalism. In some cases, I've got the crossed swords, which it says they're incompatible with occasionalism. And in some cases, or several cases, I have marked a big symbol on the left to signify at first gloss, or on the first appearance, in the case of determination, for example, the large cross swords means, on the face of it, it looks like that theory is incompatible with occasionalism. But on the right, I have the tinier circle, which says, if you look very carefully, you're going to find a way to make them compatible. That's what I'm going to argue. And the reverse of the counterfactual theory and interventionist theories. Those are intended by the people who propose them and advocate for them to be of a certain character that is compatible with occasionalism. But I think if you try to support the theory and add enough and to try to make them not false, that you'll end up having to add in resources that will make them incompatible with occasionalism. So I'm just going to use this as a device to talk about the theories and how they relate to occasionalism. Okay. So the causal, I've just picked them, the order I've chosen is just to help with the presentation. The so-called causal process theory has been around for, well, since, roughly speaking, since the late 80s. The essential idea is to try to pick out causes by looking at the paths of particles, roughly. That's the idea. So what we do is we define a causal process as the path of some entity that, so to speak, carries a conserved quantity through space and time. And we also define a causal interaction as the transfer of a conserved quantity. The conserved quantity is being shifted from one process to another. And after we have all the machinery set up, we say there's a necessary condition for two things to be in a cause-effect relation, an efficient cause-effect relation. There's got to be some causal process connecting them. I would say that these theories, with a lot of these theories that I'm talking about, I have a lot of worries about calling them theories because I don't think they're really developed enough to where they make distinctive claims. A lot of them are, I would say, works in progress. The causal process theory is one that I would say that of. There are the two books I have listed down, Kistler, try to cover them more or less comprehensively. But the problem with it being a theory is that this is a necessary connection. It requires that the actual world have particles that can convey or that can carry along conserved quantities. Maybe that's right, maybe that's not. I mean, if it's a world of electromagnetic fields, these theories don't make any sense, or they would say that there's no causation. And if there are particles, one of the problems with this theory is it's just giving us a very weak necessary condition. And just because particles are bouncing into each other all the time with conserved quantities. So if you're saying, what are the causes of leukemia, let's go back in time. Well, it's going to include basically everything in the solar system at least. So it's not going to be very good for practical questions of finding out what the causes are. And no one's really filled in the details of how the work is supposed to, exactly what the theory is going to be doing. Now, I say this for the causal process theories, but these actually hold, I think, across the board. There are two major problems with all theories of causation. first of all, methodologically, the theories have not been clear enough about what they're trying to accomplish. What would count as success for the theory, why we would care even if their theory, quote, worked, unquote. And then there's some also some further worries I have about the techniques that are used in order to identify the correct theories. A lot of times sort of appealing to your pre-theoretical or even your informed opinion about various causal scenarios. But I don't want to complain about that part. I just want to say it's not really clear what the theories are supposed to be doing. That's the biggest thing. In this case, the idea is supposed to be, once we fundamentally tell you the story, or once we tell you the story about how the particles are bouncing around, fundamentally, we're going to just read the causation relations off of that. The theory isn't filled in, but that's the essential idea. And so that's why I'm going to say that these do not posit fundamental causation-like relations, and that it's going to be therefore compatible with occasionalism. And one way to think about this is that these theories are friendly to there being fundamentally a world that's a Humean mosaic, which means a pattern in space and time of properties like mass, could be relations like velocities, could be quark colors, things like that. And so long as it has this mosaic, the complete pattern in space and time of conserved quantity shifting around, I think the hope of the theory is that you can then the theory will tell you what the causes are. There's no need for there to be some kind of causal oomph pushing the conserved quantities around. So I think this is a very kind of clean-cut case of a theory that's compatible. Another case that's also compatible with occasionalism are what are called probability theories. There's something a bit misleading about the name because there are a lot of different forms that probabilities can take, and this is just one specific way in which the probabilities could be mixed into a theory of causation, into a theory of reality. If I could go back and change the terminology, I would say these are kind of cleaned up statistical theories of causation. And what I mean by that is that the way that there are some quantities that are being called probabilities on this theory, and the way they are arriving at these probabilities is not looking at any laws that tell you what the probabilities are. What they're doing, in effect, is looking at the full pattern of what happens in the world, coming up with choices about how to conceptualize the world in terms of event types. So it could be something like contracting cancer or smoking a cigarette or something like that. And then it will just be a fact then, if you look at the world, about where the patterns are of these different events getting instantiated. And you look at the patterns of these instances, and then it collects the statistics of how they're related to each other. And then you clean up the statistics a little bit in light of some extra facts. And the extra facts are ones that they don't really ever list, tell you what they are, but a lot of times they involve symmetry. So if you look at the statistics of coin flips or dice rolls, and it's not quite 50-50 for the coin flips, not quite 1/6 for the die rolls, I think practically speaking what the people in this theory are going to do are just going to say, well, that's just because the outcomes never perfectly, or virtually never perfectly match the probabilities. And so they will assign a probability of 1/6 to all the different outcomes of unfixed dice. And the idea is just do this for all the events you're possibly concerned with. If you do that, you'll have a pattern, a bunch of mathematical relationships, quantifications, and that's your data. Those are your probabilities. And then the theory is supposed to let you draw inferences about causation from those theories. The people who have been involved in this include so Nancy Cartwright, who thinks that you can't derive everything about causation from the probabilities, but then I'm blanking on a few of the others. I think Wesley Salmon had an idea of this. This was popular back in the 70s. Ellery Ells had some theory kind of like this. I'm just giving you a simple version here that says, once you've got all those probabilistic relations, you can define what it means for some event or action to cause another event. It just means the probability is higher with the cause than without. Now, stated that simply, there are going to be recognized problems, because sometimes whenever certain kinds of effects happen that make the probability of earlier events more probable. If you have a wet pavement, it was probably because there was rain, things like that. So you would need to build in some principles not to get the direction of causation going towards the past. You would need to account for the fact that sometimes these probabilities will be higher because there's a common cause of two effects, and then there's a bunch more. And then it's just the project of these theories to spell out the details and try to get the probabilistic information to match up with what they think are the real causes. Now, the important thing for us is just that all of these probabilities, all of these patterns are the kinds of things you could find in the Humean mosaic. They don't require there to be some kind of fundamental law that has a probabilistic nature. It's just a bunch of statistical data, you might say. And because of that, because there's no extra posit that the entities be linked by some law, it's compatible with occasionalism. End of my story there. Now, I'll contrast this with the determination account, which on the surface, at least, sounds like it's incompatible with occasionalism. The determination account is quite unpopular. It was mentioned most prominently recently by Mackey in 1973, but his theory was often talking about our notion of cause, so he wasn't really advocating what he thinks is going on fundamentally in nature. But we can just take his theory and imagine someone who believes that something like the theory he was describing holds in the actual world. Now, we can just define determination very easily. One event, C, determines another. If C, together with any laws of nature, specifically a law that tells you how the world develops through time, what we call a dynamical law. If that implies that E will happen, then we say C determines E. Then it's rather trivial to define a partial cause of any event E as a part of a minimal determinant. That is, take any event that determines E, strip out anything you can in a way that will keep it determining E, then all of its parts are going to be partial causes. This is the famous Inus account of causation. And what happens in practice with this account is that of the events we care about, sort of macroscopic events, it turns out then on this theory, given any kind of plausible law, that the things that end up determining it are vast expanses of physics, ginormous physical states that are fully specified in complete detail. So for any event like this, if you want to figure out what caused it 1 second ago, this would be a full microscopically precise state stretching far out beyond the moon. Anything short of that will not determine the effect. And all of the partial causes, the ones we normally cite, are going to be very tiny, and the theory itself is not going to is not going to pick out what we think of as the important causes. Now, the way Mackey put it, his theory would apply even if we were talking about mundane affairs. But I think it's just easy to tell from just doing some rudimentary physics that there are no such laws, determining laws, governing macroscopic objects, governing the actions of people and so forth. There are no such laws of determination. Now, so that's the theory, and let me tell you what I think about its compatibility with occasionalism. So on the surface, it looks like the theory is saying there are fundamental determination relations among these microscopically precise events. And I think that is, unless we have some special, something more to say, I think that's how the kind of Newtonian theory of gravitation would work. I think the simple model is there's a space-time, there are a bunch of masses, there's a law that tells, that indicates how the arrangement of masses at one time fixes a unique way for them to be located and be arranged at other times. That's the fundamental structure of the theory, you might say. This is not what Newton said, but at least on a simple version of it, the laws are determining what happens, and end of story. Incompatible with occasionalism. But I think there are two loopholes, and one is that there's this position famously now known as Humean supervenience, the point of which is to deny the existence of these determination relations, as well as to deny anything kind of like them, any powers or any real, quote, real dispositions, unquote, any kind of causal oomph in the world. And so according to this Humean supervenience, to part of Humean supervenience is that this Humean mosaic is enough to imply whatever laws there are. The way I would define the Humean supervenience is to say it states that there are no fundamental laws. So if you could defend the theory, then what you could say is, say in the Newtonian picture, there's an arrangement of masses at each time, and then the theory would say there are no laws. Now, if you thought that was a good theory of this Newtonian world, then you could say, fundamentally there are no causation-like relations, but my Humean supervenience rule is good enough to tell me that there are, you might say, derivative laws, or it would say, there's a pattern that these planets are all moving around, and they're handy for doing science, so we will, we'll be able to point to these laws and say that they help us to explain the motions of particles, but they won't be there in fundamental reality, quote, doing anything, unquote, or, quote, governing, unquote, the motions of the particles. Okay, so if you have that theory, then you would have what's often called you have something very close to what's called a regularity theory. Now, at this point, I'm just going to delay talk about this and leave that to Ed. The other possibility that I'm going to try to take up on the weekend is that the determination that the story is much more complicated. That the fundamental reality is not just a bunch of stuff in space-time, but it's in some other kind of structure. Now, if you have that theory, and it had these fundamental determination relations in it, because the fundamental relations don't match up with the causes here in space-time, or because there are no fundamental causation-like relations here in space and time, there will be, to the extent there are determination relations at all, they'll have to be derivative. Therefore, this is all going to be compatible with occasionalism. So I think something like that is possible. But I don't know of anyone who's given even a toy model of that would, that I could point to and say, oh, here's a case where the determination theory could be kind of twisted or modified to be compatible with occasionalism. Okay, so let me just go back to the chart here. What I've tried to show you is that the top two are, I think, straightforwardly compatible with occasionalism, and then the last one on the surface seems to be incompatible with it, but maybe you can twist it or modify it a little bit to make it compatible as a research project. Okay, next step. The two most popular theories of causation right now, maybe far and away the two most popular, though I didn't look up the statistics on these, if there are any, are the counterfactual theory and the interventionist theory. So, just to give you some motivation, there was some research by Nelson Goodman a long time ago. I think in the 30s, was writing some papers, and it showed up in his work on his philosophy of science later in 47. The same one that does the new riddle. I forget, I'm blanking on the name of the book now. 47 or so, but he gives you what is, in a way, a kind of counterfactual theory. And then, with all this work on philosophy of language and the language of conditionals, this became popular in the 70s with the Stalnaker and Lewis views. Now, the reason for these theories, I think, gets to something that's exactly right about causation, is that we think that one of the reasons why I identify something as a cause is because it engages in the activity of affecting. Now, in order to get a good grip on what this affecting means and why we should think about it counterfactually, so to speak, I think it's helpful here to think about this discussion we often have when we're talking about time travel to the past. So the standard story is you go back to the past and try, you'll end up, the time travelers who go to the past will end up interacting with the world, and to the very naive interpreter of that, it will seem that they might be changing things in the past. And then if you're the Philosophy 101 instructor, you help your students see that it can't possibly be that the time traveler is changing what happened in the past, because that would require that there be two incompatible things happening at one and the same time. That is, at least if we have a view of history that there's one consistent way that things have happened, then the better way to describe how the time traveler is interacting is that the time traveler is not changing the past, but affecting the past. Then we say, well, what is affecting the past? And that means to make the past different from the way it would have been had you not been there. And all of that kind of discussion works perfectly well with regard to the future. So what it means for you or for an event or action or anything like that to affect the future is for that event, to make the future different from the way it would have been had the event not happened or had it happened some other way. And all of that is to say that the way to interpret the term affect is going to be naturally expressible in using counterfactual words. Would have been, things like that. Now, at this point, the philosophical research on this was a complete disaster, I think. I think a nice way to set up, the motivation for the counterfactual theory is to say, one tool that's going to be very useful is to think of a contrast between two what-ifs. Imagine what could happen if any event you care to consider C had occurred, and then what would have happened if it had not occurred or if it had occurred in a different way. And then wherever there's a mismatch, we say there's affecting going on. Now, the question is at this point, well, how do we figure out, what would have happened had C been different or had it not happened? This is kind of left open. I think there are two ways that you could think about this. One is the way that Nelson Goodman, I think, sort of had in mind, which is you make an alteration to you imagine the world at one time, you have it happen, you include this event C, and you let your laws tell you what happens at other times. Then you go back and you make a second pass where you change C, or the event C around, or you get rid of it, or somehow make it not happen, almost kind of as kind of act of God, like starting the universe at a certain time. Then you let the laws tell you what happens at other times, and you compare those two. And that's what we ought to call what's called counterfactual dependence. We're comparing the way the actual world goes, or could have gone, or would have gone, from the way things would have gone in some non-actual world. That's one way. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's been treated in most of philosophy. For some reason that I find hard to understand, what happened was philosophers started using the logic of English counterfactual sentences. So you can do a lot of research into philosophy of language and the kind of semantics you do in logic class, and you come up with these rules for how our ordinary language works with regard to counterfactual statements. And then using that as a kind of constraint or template, then you try to cook up some theory about, consistent with this logic or semantics of counterfactuals, how things would have occurred differently. And you, in this case, typically do not use the laws, or you don't presuppose that there are any fundamental laws for sure. And the reason it's implausible is just because, if you're thinking about this, you might say scientifically, I think this affecting, this causation in this sense, should be thought of as a kind of investigation as if we're looking at forces or energy. And of course, I hope it is sensible that we wouldn't want to look at the semantics of how people talked about forces and energy and use that as a constraint on our physicists. We would just say, polish up those concepts however you find convenient. Okay, anyway, the reason I state that is that with that second view where you're basing everything on languages and you're not using any fundamental laws to help guide you as to how to evaluate these counterfactual conditionals, that's going to be what I've labeled here up at the top as that's the mainstream view, and that's one that is motivated by the idea that we don't need to posit any fundamental laws, we don't need to posit necessitation or powers or things like that. So that's why I'm thinking that the standard kind of counterfactual views are ones that are compatible with occasionalism. Because I find that to be the theories that have have been that way generated have been a disaster. I think that you need to go back to something like what Nelson Goodman had in mind and build in a little bit more structure as to how you evaluate your counterfactuals. But as soon as you build that in, you're sort of opening up the possibility that you're going to have at least some kind of underlying laws, and maybe, I'll leave this open, maybe these would end up being fundamental causation-like laws. I said causal-like on the chart, but causation-like. And so the threat of incompatibility, I think it's re-raised. Okay, so at this point, I just want to say a little bit more because these are such popular theories. So I think if you were going to try to take occasionalism and mix it up and to be compatible with a kind of counterfactual theory of causation, what you would want to do is one of the two projects. You would either want to provide some theory about how counterfactuals would work in a way that would give rise to, or it would be compatible with, there being a kind of non-fundamental law dictating how nature develops through time. Or you would just entirely bypass the ordinary way we think about counterfactuals and somehow support your theory of how to evaluate counterfactuals. I'm not sure what it would even mean for such a theory to be defended. But that's just because it's not really clear what any of these theories of causation are attempting to accomplish. The first theory I have in mind is, the point I have here is that if you're going to make occasionalism and counterfactual theories compatible, what you want to do is at least make sense of our ordinary practice of using laws in order to engage in reasoning about how the physical world works. Okay, so that's just to recap. I'm in effect raising problems for the counterfactual theory, and I'm going to do the same thing for the interventionist theory. The interventionist theory is extremely popular lately, and it turns out to be much like the counterfactual theory. The idea is pushed a lot, or the activity of causal modeling was very popular in science and was spelled out in great detail in a book by Pearl in 2000. And there were some earlier books, but it's been picked up recently and it's been in a lot of the journals. And the interventionist theory can also be thought of as the causal model theory. And what happens is, in these theories, we don't think about fundamental reality. We set that aside. We just take a bunch of causation as scientists think about it. And when they are modeling the world in terms of graphs with variables and equations. And then we define a concept called an intervention that's going to, in a way, let us modify the graph and get some information about it. And all of our causal claims then are going to, in some way, depend on these graphs and the variables and the equations that set them up. So on the top here, I've depicted a kind of standard graph, and you can think about these variables as being things like the V could be vegetation level, A might be the number of people who are living in the nearby community. You pick some event types of a quite normal sort, and the causal model theory gives you what you're supposed to be supplied with is the graph of how these variables interrelate and some equations that tell you specifically how the values of the nodes, i.e. variables downstream, depend on the ones that are coming from the tails of the arrows. That's all good for doing observations, but when we want to know about causation, what the interventionist tells us we should do is we should imagine doing an alteration to the graph. In this case, if we want to figure out how much the vegetation is affecting, I don't know, at the pollution level or something, what we would do, the variable b over here, what we would do is imagine getting rid of the variable a, which might represent the population and its effect on the vegetation level, and just imagine going in with a new event I that just sets the vegetation level to whatever value we care to be interested in. Then we use the very same equations we use above that we do in our science, and we let us tell us how much B changes depending on how we change B. And it's just facts like that, facts about the model that are going to tell us what the model says about causation. Now, I think that all of this just goes to show it's going to be, we're going to say the very same story about interventionism that we said about counterfactuals. So the theory by itself is not metaphysical, it's not trying to say anything about fundamental reality, but we can think about it as a counterfactual theory in the sense that what this intervention is doing is counterfactually altering the vegetation level, and what the model is telling, the equations that are given to us with the model are giving us the laws for how things evolve. So again, it's counterfactual with some extra resources to tell us how the world, how it changes. And now, whether it's compatible with occasionalism depends on what whether the things that are ultimately responsible for these laws are fundamental causation-like relations. Thus, we end up with the same answer. Okay, so what's our time left?
So we have 35 minutes.
Okay, I can get. I just have one statement for each of these, so it should be quick here. Those are the 5 main theories. We should probably concentrate on those. I just don't want to kind of dismiss other views entirely. There's a recent movement to think about causations as being based on powers or dispositions. Causes produce their effects in an irreducibly dispositional way. I find I'm just a little bit hesitant to shoehorn these theories into my distinction between fundamental and derivative. On the one hand, you see, as I've quoted here, it says it should be possible to get a theory, or others have suggested it should be possible to get a theory of causation from an ontology of real dispositions or powers. In my mind, that should be interpreted as fundamental, but I don't think Andrew and Mumford quite mean it that way. So in a way, I'm just not sure what to say about these theories. Do they posit, their project in a way is switching the talk of causes into dispositions and powers. To my mind, I guess in my way of thinking about it, either way of talking, you're going to be able to say much the same things, and the unresolved question is are these powers or dispositions fundamental or not?
So you can ask this question on Sunday.
Right. Yes.
Presenting on this disposition.
Right. Yes. That's why I made a special point of mentioning this. Yes. Good. I normally don't like saying I don't know what to say, but there you have it. There are some other theories that I also find a bit puzzling. I want to draw attention to this one that E.J. Lowe does, where it sounds like to me what he's trying to do is talk about causation in a way that essentially or it requires for there to be causation that there be some kind of fundamental agency. To me, this sounds like it's incompatible with occasionalism just because it's involving agents in space and time that are interacting. Of course, you could. Nothing about the theory by itself says that there would just be one agent, God, doing all the causing, and therefore, giving you an adequate account of causation compatible with occasionalism. But if that's the view, then I take it you would be defending occasionalism and using that as a way of defending Lowe's view, not the other way around. Another way to think about it is if there's going to be this problem in Lowe's case of how we talk about causation when there are no agents around. And I think his theory doesn't make much sense in those kinds of cases, but if you want to do it by appealing to the agency of God, then basically you're not using Lowe to defend occasionalism, but occasionalism to defend Lowe. Fine. Okay, so the manipulationist theories are one of these theories that, again, are really too underspecified. Von Wright wrote some snippets about it where he says his view is that there's another way in which causation can be essentially agential, and he said we're just going to define causes. That P is a cause of Q means if I could bring about Q. I could bring about Q if I could, in a sense, bring about P. My thought is that that using bring about is a bit ambiguous. To me, I want to use the word bring about as implying some kind of fundamental causation like relations, but and so I would think it's incompatible, but he left that a bit open. And the theory wasn't really clear about what. You could think about it as more a theory about how to think about how much of causation is human based, or how much it depends on us and how much it depends on the world. And he thought more depends on us and our way of thinking about the world as being at least subject to potential manipulation. There's something I think that's deep and correct about this, in the sense that if you think about our platitudes regarding causation, some of them break down into ones that are very friendly to this Humean mosaic idea, and others of which seem to be much more based on the idea of influence and manipulation, and the idea of causation being, if I could just fiddle with this part of the world, another part of the world would have to change correspondingly. And so I think there's something right about focusing on this, you might say, intervention or counterfactual dependence or manipulation or something like that, as being what makes the theory fully causal, as opposed to the kinds of pictures I mentioned earlier where you're just trying to pull out causal facts merely from the statistics. Finally, there's kind of these straightforwardly singularist theories. I associate these with Michael Tooley, some arguments to the main point of which was to say we don't really need laws and regularities, that we can observe and there can exist causal relations that are singular, they happen once, they're real, my science can observe them, I don't need some kind of general law under which they follow. To my mind, that is about as close to a claim that there are these fundamental causation-like relations as you're going to get. And so that's why I categorize these as being rather straightforwardly incompatible with occasionalism. Okay, so I've said a lot there because those are 9 categories, so I think I would like to turn it over to everyone else. Okay.
Doc, you just repeatedly said fundamental laws. What do you mean by fundamental laws? Do you mean fundamental laws of nature or fundamental laws of physics?
I meant of nature. My picture was supposed to be one where if if you want to include non-physical stuff in your theory of fundamental reality, that would be compatible with everything. So, in fact, the way I've set everything up, I'm thinking just about every theory ever invented could be kind of squeezed into my formulation.
But then, when you talk about theories, you are talking about laws of physics.
Yes.
Laws of nature, you know, this is a concept that has been misused until now. There is a confusion between, even among physicists, when they talk about laws of physics. Paul Davies, for example, a very famous physicist who writes in Science and Religion, he talks about laws of physics and he means laws of nature, and sometimes he talks about laws of nature and says, I mean to say laws of physics. There are two different things. Laws of nature are the phenomena. For example, solar eclipse, a regular phenomena suggests a law of nature. Fire burns cotton, a law of nature. But when I describe this by a mathematical formula or whatever kind of a description, trying to explain the phenomena, then I am setting a law of physics. And when we talk about theories, therefore we're always talking about laws of physics. Well, physics here means chemistry, means biology, means any scientific law, which is my invention. The human being is describing it in terms of a mental, rational description for the phenomena. That's a law of physics. Therefore, as you very well know, laws of nature, according to quantum mechanics, are indeterministic. Therefore, they cannot be or cannot establish causation according to quantum mechanics. But in classical physics, these laws of nature are deterministic and therefore they can establish causation. If we accept the quantum thesis, as you already mentioned, or you will talk about it, it goes very well with occasionalism, I think. Otherwise, we have to defend the question of indeterminism and try to find a way out in order to establish causation again.
Oh, okay, so a few things to be said. First of all, I use the determination account because this is, as we're popular, as we're in the history of philosophy of coming up with these. I have found, just in my own research, that it's quite trivial to convert these determination accounts to handle the kinds of chanciness, fundamental chanciness that are in quantum mechanical theories. So if you just replace, one event determines another with one event determines a probability distribution over a set of events, one of which occurs, say, later, that will be good enough to capture, that will be a good enough way to capture all of the causation important features of the theory. So it's just my own contention that extending these theories to fundamentally chancy theories like quantum mechanics is not difficult. And it's already in my book, so, okay, but another point was that I certainly don't want it to be a kind of theory that is meant to apply only to physics. I can imagine Berkeley going in and specifying the mental states of all souls at a single time. If there are determination relations, the theory should be able to account for those. Now, no one's ever provided any plausible, determination rules of how souls evolve over time.
One thing is important. What you just said is correct. Because, for example, the Schrodinger equation is deterministic, and it gives you the time development of quantum system. But then, the quantum state itself, which is indeterministic. So what you are saying is, but I'm afraid it applies only to the time development of the quantum system. It doesn't apply to the quantum state itself, unless you have better explanation.
I have arguments that I have not presented here because it's my own argument. Yeah. Yeah. So. Okay.
Jim,
Brandon, go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks. And this may be very short. I like what you said at the very beginning about how we shouldn't think of ontology and how we should think of ontology. I'm sympathetic to what you were saying there. But I have one question about the way that latches onto your account of these different theories of causation, in particular with respect to the counterfactual case. Because when you're giving an account, a counterfactual account of causation, you're saying, well, if that hadn't happened, then this wouldn't have happened, blah, blah, blah. So in one sense, you are making claims about non-being, say. And so I wonder how if you can say a little bit more about what it means that you're talking about when you're making those kinds of claims.
You want my own theory of how it all works? I've got
Give me
that.
any theory.
Uh,
Give me your own, the one you like the most.
Okay, so here's the way I would evaluate the counterfactuals. So the way I would think of fundamental reality, I would equate that with the actual world. And so we can imagine it, just to keep things simple, as a bunch of atoms bouncing around in the void. When you're thinking about, and let's say also with determination relations, or let's say probability fixing relations, the way I would set up the counterfactuals is you get to choose any event you want. You're allowed to pick any counterfactual event you want. Let's go to the fundamental laws to see what they imply. In some cases, those laws are going to imply no difference in the same probabilities, say, will be fixed for later events. Sometimes they'll be different. Whatever that quantity is, this difference in the probabilities that get fixed by these events, that ends up being a very useful quantity for measuring counterfactual dependence. And those things are going to count as part of derivative reality because what you've done when you've moved from, because in part you've used some fundamental reality as a resource. You chose, let's say, one actual state to be concerned with. But then you've added a lot of what I call fundamentally arbitrary parameters, choices. How do you want to describe the counterfactual possibilities? But you've also used some actual resources, actual laws. And so I would say that that kind of a quantity would be a derivative quantity. It would help you do your science. It would help you understand causation. And so you're kind of licensed to think about other possible worlds.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug, for that. Just a quick question about the compatible with occasionalism bit.
Okay.
I wonder if it's a little disingenuous in some of these cases. Right? Suppose I have a simple regularity view of causation. Right? Generally, the spirit of that is there's regularities, install a few conditions, and that's all. To say that that's compatible with occasionalism seems a bit disingenuous. Well, you see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. I think this is just me taking shortcuts with the language. What I mean is, it's easy to take that theory, add in fundamental causation coming from God or from something else, and then you've got your occasionalist picture. So as it were, what it is that the occasionalist is compatible with a regularity theory of causation for stuff in space-time. Is that? Is that satisfactory? I mean, it would
Yeah,
still have,
it's
it would,
fine. It's, in a way, I mean, if I believe that theory, though, I think there's no reason to postulate anything else. If that theory were good, then we'd be done. And then to say that's compatibilism with, to say it's compatible with occasionalism, say, I could also throw in God. You might think, well, I guess so.
I agree with that, but I was just saying, that's a reason not to believe, in that case, you just wouldn't want to believe compatibilism. I think maybe another way to think about it is if you already had a reason to believe there was some kind of causational God, and you just said, okay, let's just see what that implies for space and time, and there's no more, there are no causation relations.
I totally understand and appreciate the spirit of it. You might think conversely, though, right? If you were an occasionalist, then you wouldn't need the regularity theory, right? You could say, make your distinctions. All that hard work would be sort of pointless in spelling out the conditions because, in fact, C would be a cause if and only if, on the occasion of C, God willed E.
Yeah, sure.
So that makes the tension feel a little bit
Right.
worse than,
Right.
Anyway,
Exactly.
thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, this is related to his, because actually, interestingly, we'll see, I almost have described these in the opposite way that you have, so it'll be interesting. Good. But I think one of the reasons is that I'm thinking of this issue in terms of a theory of causation. And one sort of way to make things clear in my mind is to differentiate theory of causation from philosophy of nature. Okay? These are two questions that are separate. We have to ask, for example, what analysis of causation, right, is compatible with occasionalism? And another question is, what philosophy of nature is compatible with occasionalism? Right? Part of the confusion for us is that occasionalism starting in started in the Islamic period. They were only concerned with what philosophy of nature is compatible with occasionalism. And as far as I know, I don't see any introduction of this question about, well, what is causation? Okay? Now in the contemporary modern times, we have this topic or question, what is causation? These are theories of causation. They're not philosophies of nature. So we have theories of causation and we have philosophies of nature that those theories facilitate or don't facilitate, right? And sometimes we have theories of causation that are motivated by certain philosophies of nature, or they come together. But I think we have to differentiate the two. And then the third, which is, if we have what's the philosophy of nature, what is causation, and what does it mean to say that something causes something? So what's the concept of cause? And this is separable in sometimes from what causation is, And we always have to ask what the theory is actually doing when we look at the theory, because sometimes the theories, they're all called theories of causation, but in fact, one theory is trying to do something quite different from another one, And I think this causes it makes it kind of fuzzy when we ask about the relation to causation.
Yeah. So I should add that part of the way I'm thinking about philosophy is in the Wilfrid Sellars way of basically conceptual engineering, so that especially the way we think about causation is supposed to be a kind of starting point that we then use to make precise in various ways, and then also to make, in a way, fuzzier if we think these would be just distinctions that won't make a difference. So this is why we have a vast literature of causation. It's not really, not really clear what the methodology is, what the extent of the theories are, what even our initial concept is that we're interested in investigating.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Your theories of causation, all of them fall at the derivative level. Derivative relative. They are, you apply statistical models or other models and you determine whether they are true, they are law-like, they are causal law-like, etc. Whereas occasionalism would be something which would not be determined in terms of truth or probability or something like that. It would be more a matter of belief or meaning, whatever you say. So, you are trying to make compatible two things. At one place, belief or meaning, and the other place you have truth-like things. Have I got it correct?
I'm just confused by what you mean by belief and meaning. I thought we were talking about God's.
I was talking to Brandon after the first session. I put this question to him that if you draw God out of the equation, would occasionalism make sense? And I think so, and he also thinks so, that it doesn't. So it's a matter of belief, it's a matter of meaning, or seeing things from a certain perspective. Is it? Or is it?
I'm still puzzled about what the debate we would have would be about. So I'm imagining here that
God doesn't exist, occasionalism is false.
okay,
God exists, maybe occasionalism is true.
okay.
I don't see what, I mean, we want our beliefs to be true.
So what
Separate beliefs.
was this meant as conflicting with something I said? Is that
No. Correct me if I
Okay.
got it wrong, that you are trying to make consistent something that involves truth with something that involves meaning or beliefs, one's commitment to a certain point of view.
Because belief doesn't have anything to do with truth. It's totally separate.
yeah, that's why I guess I'm puzzled about the question. I guess here, what I was thinking of, part of why. So one of the things that I left out of this discussion that would be good to talk about is, so I mainly focused on the part about, just because I thought it was just my assignment, was just to talk about whether these theories had efficient causal relations, without saying a whole lot about occasionalism. Of course, then we have the other component that not only do we not want efficient causation, interworld, but we also want the causation coming from God to the rest of the world. And a lot of these aren't even going to make sense. The only one I think that can sort of make sense is the determination, and that's the necessary will of God, that kind of thing. And that's what I'll try to build on in the this weekend. I guess I certainly wasn't trying to come at this from the point of view of taking compatibilists occasionalists and people who bring modern theory and sort of figuring out how people could match up as friends or anything. I'm thinking about this as, one thing for any of you interested in occasionalism that would be, I think, a useful activity to engage in is to try to see how to make more precise what these relations are in a way that's compatible with what we know about science. And so we're kind of science, putting it all in the scientific lingo and how I would make it more precise. So just sort of hoping to kind of encourage research in this way, along these lines. Yeah.
So you didn't talk about the regularity theories. Do you think it's reducible to some of them, or is...
So I did very quickly pass by regularity theory as a special case of the determination theory.
Okay.
So the way I was categorizing, so what I think is going on with the regularity theory is it's sort of like a determination theory, and then you strip out the determination. So my theory was, regularity theories these days, the only time you see this ever mentioned in the literature is as some foil for someone else's theory. Everyone has 100 complaints about the theory. I was just mentioning it that, to me, the way I think about it is it's a poor man's determination theory. the determination theory wants there to be some actual sort of pushing and pulling, and then a lot of people say, well, the necessary connection, you know, we shouldn't believe in that. We've got epistemic reasons for getting rid of it. And so, okay, just yank that out of the theory, and then you'll have a Humean mosaic now. And so, I suppose the only way you can get the regularity theories to work is if you somehow talk about laws, but just don't put them into your fundamental ontology or your metaphysics. And so it'll just become a very stripped down determination theory. And so you can think about it as the little peace sign to the right determination. That's the way I think about it.
Determination was the Einstein, right?
Was the what? Yeah.
Could you please say a bit more about the questionable status of a power-based theory of causation vis-a-vis not being a case of a fundamental, causation-like relation?
Right. I'm just saying that because so if you read their work, and here I'm just basing it on Angelman Mumford's work. If you read their work, they're taking a lot of effort to knock down the idea that causation requires determination, or in the lingo, necessary connections. But and when pressed with the question, well, who knows? Maybe science it'll turn out that the world is deterministic. So then, how does your theory end up? And what they want to say is, well, even if we find out that fundamental physics is deterministic, or fundamental theory is deterministic, then there will still be dispositions, there will still be powers, kind of at macro level of description, and we still need to somehow account for all of these. And that leads me to think that they want to insulate their theory of powers and causation from what's going on fundamentally, or even if there is a fundamental reality, they might want to. So it's just my reading of their work that they're not particularly, they're certainly not framing their work in terms of fundamental and derivative, and they kind of want to leave that open. And so in that case, to the extent that theory is successful at whatever it's doing, it's not going to be compatible because all the relations they're going to be talking about are, in my language, derivative.
So what about like a view like pan-dispositionalism?
I take it where that's fundamental, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that that's incompatible, but to me, but this is almost kind of definitional to me. I mean, if you're saying there's some part of the fundamental metaphysics that's doing something causation-like, which I guess this disposition would be doing. I mean, maybe we'd have to get to the fine details to figure out what it's doing, but it sounds like robust metaphysical structure that's doing something beyond, in space and time, beyond just kind of being there as an effective God. Then that sounds incompatible to me, but that just might be a semantic nicety.
One last question. Okay.
Very simple question, and it echoes with some of the questions asked earlier. I just want to ask whether this is a hypothetical exercise, or are you aware of any actual attempts to marry any of these theories of causation with an occasionalist worldview in modern theology?
I see. I'm trying to do that.
You are? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know of any, I'm not aware of any theory that's tried to, but I'm largely, if there's some recent work on occasionalism, I'm ignorant of it. I mean, it's not just historical, but it's like a revitalization. But that's what I'm trying to do, actually.
So there's a theological background to this, I take it.
Well, I won't go that far, but I've got, so what I'll be doing this weekend is trying to show you how, if you kind of bend and stretch the concepts a little bit, modern physics could well support occasionalism.
A short question. So I believe someone introduced the notion of pseudo processes. So right is the car, and the travel of the car, and the travel of the shadow.
Right.
In that case, this regularity theories cannot distinguish between these two. And probably occasionalism can also not distinguish between these two cases.
So when I was talking about the causal process theory, so what you could do, that I think the occasionalism alone couldn't, I don't see any reason why it couldn't. And so I guess the way I see Salmon's picture here is that you add in something like the causal process theory to your occasionalism, then you would be able to derive this distinction. Now, I'm still puzzled about why worry about this distinction should carry on for 20, 30 years. I'm not sure really what. There was some kind of initial gloss on the idea that shadows and a beam of, or a spot of light on the wall can travel faster than light, but particles can't travel faster than light. So there was some idea in Salmon's mind that this was a causal distinction, and you want a theory to make the distinction. But I take it the science of a spot of light on the wall is not controversial. I mean, we know if you have a beam of light and you're shining it on a wall that's really, really far away, yes, the spot of light on the wall spatially is moving faster than light, but relativity doesn't tell you it should be slower than light. So I don't know why it's worth spending journal space talking about the distinction. That's not. It's another bit of evidence. I'm not sure why or what people are trying to do with these theories.
They can't distinguish between regularity and just the other more robust notions of causation.
Yes.
So counterfactual theories can distinguish pseudo processes from non-pseudo processes. Maybe that can be given as an indirect support for saying that counterfactual theories cannot be compatible with regularity or occasionalism. Yeah,
I see. So the way I would think about it though is that the reason counterfactual theories are able to account for it is because you're kind of smuggling in some extra stuff about laws of nature and things like that.
So, in person. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.